Oh, I hope everyone's having a fantastic evening. Thanks for joining us tonight on Inspire Advantage's webinar, How to Submit the Perfect Application, or Perfect Primary Application, I should say. So first and foremost, I just have a couple of housekeeping rules, so to speak. This webinar is recorded and you will receive a recording in your inbox within the next couple of days. Additionally, we're looking at running this webinar for about 45 minutes with about 10 to 15 minutes at the end where you actually get a Q&A session with our two panelists here who will be introducing themselves momentarily. So throughout the course of the webinar, we of course encourage you to ask as many questions as you see fit, whether it be about the, submitting your application or the med school process. That's what we're here for, and that's what we are looking forward to supporting you with. Quick overview. So we'll be discussing the application components, how to write a compelling personal statement, highlighting your experiences and activities, and of course, securing strong letters of recommendation. I just want to take a quick moment to introduce who we are, whether this is your first webinar with us or you've been here before, welcome. And I know I speak on behalf of our team. We're super excited to have you here. So who is Inspira? So Inspira Advantage is a globally recognized admissions consulting and test prep firm with 15 years of experience. We specialize in guiding students through the complex and competitive process of applying to healthcare graduate programs, including medical, dental, veterinary, and nursing, and of course, PA. With a 94% acceptance rate, we maximize your chances of getting into the world's top programs. We believe in starting the candidacy development process early. For college freshmen, we offer pre-health advising and profile development. We help you plan your academic journey, choosing the right experiences, and building a strong application portfolio. This includes guidance on research, clinical, volunteering, and leadership roles to ensure you stand out. Our tutors provide personalized one-on-one tutoring, beginning with a diagnostic test to assess strengths and weaknesses. We create a customized study plan and monitor process with interim tests, aiming for constant improvement. Our MCAT students typically see a 15-point increase with a 45 plus hours of tutoring, and we offer a score guarantee for our 60-hour programs. After helping you build a strong profile, our all-inclusive application programs offer unlimited support through the entire application cycle. We assist in everything from crafting your personal statement to finalizing your school list and submitting applications. We are with you until you receive your acceptance. Our goal is to help you become the most competitive candidate possible. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about us, we offer free consultations via video, phone, or email. Let our admissions counselors help guide you through the process, no matter where you are in the application journey. With that being said, I'd love to pass it over to our two panelists to introduce themselves and get on with the presentation.
I can go first. Hi, I'm Nate Overholzer. I am a rising fifth year MD PhD student at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine, where I study neuroscience for my PhD.
Hey guys, my name is Ruchi. I'm actually also an MD PhD student at the Yale School of Medicine. I'm entering my fourth year and I study immunology.
Cool, I can take the first slide. So understanding the primary application process. I know August can seem really early to start thinking about primary applications, but it's actually really never too early to start having primary applications. Having like a well-prepared plan always makes the process so much smoother for every client and can really help alleviate some of the anxieties and some of the mysteries about like what actually goes into it. So starting to think about the primary application even before you started and even early on in the early pre-med years is really good because it can help you craft a really compelling primary application. So what is the primary application? The primary application is the first step in your medical school journey. It's a comprehensive overview that includes your academic history, so thinking like your grades and all of your coursework, MCAT, experiences, so talking about your activities, extracurriculars, hobbies, personal motivations that you really get into in your personal statement. It allows you to really craft a compelling story of you as a candidate and your suitability for a career in medicine. It is reviewed by all the schools you apply to, and it is, as it says, really crucial to get it right, because this is something that is seen by every single school, so it leaves a big impact overall. You submit the primary application through AMCAS for allopathic schools. Those are the MD schools. ACOMAS for the osteopathic or DO schools. And I don't even know how to say this one. I just say the Texas application system. I'm not from Texas, so I don't know, Richie might know the.
Yeah, I actually am from Texas.
There you go, how do you say it?
Funnily enough, so yeah. Or there's also the TMD-SAS application, which is for all 13 Texas schools, and recently has moved to include Baylor as well.
Okay. Cool. We can move on to the next slide.
So some key deadlines and timelines. It's really important, even if you start in August, to make sure that you create a plan and that you have an idea of when you want to submit your primary application by. The first day to submit your primary application is on June 1st. So getting it as close to that deadline as possible so you can be reviewed first is really important in the medical school process. And you want to create a list of all the schools that you're applying to and stay organized throughout this process if possible.
Yeah, and there are even, I think, sometimes some things that people don't anticipate is there can be deadlines for your primary application even before that date. If your school has a composite letter or a committee letter, I've seen schools have deadlines to get that composite or committee letter or as early as December, as before that junior applying. So that's even 6 months. So you really got to start thinking about some of those things. And sometimes they have requirements like you already need to have your letter writers submitted or some organization plan with your letter writers, or you need to have a CV or resume for them. So it's really important to start looking at the whole perspective and big picture of the timeline about a year in advance.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Nate. And then also once you submit that primary application, most schools will have a secondary application that you have to submit, and trying to submit that around 2 weeks after they send it to you is ideal.
Cool.
So just wanted to hop back in here. Oh, it took a second for the camera to turn on just to see if we have any questions thus far. And if you don't have any questions, just want to remind you, pop them in the chat and we'll make sure that either Nate or Ruchi or both of them get back to you. So far, I don't see anything, so I think we're good to continue.
Cool. So general overview of application components. So your academic history, this is going to be based on your transcripts and your coursework. Going into a little bit into the academic history, you should early on, at the latest by the beginning of May, start to order your transcripts so they're actually received by the application services. You have to order transcripts from every school that you have taken a college level course at. And every college level course has to go on there. There are 2 types of GPAs that end up on your, actually 3 types of GPAs. There's the overall GPA, which is what most applicants are most familiar with. It includes all your classes. There's something called your science GPA or BPCM GPA. The science GPA doesn't have to be just limited to B, P, C, and M, which is biology, physics, chemistry, and math. If there's a course that it covers, the rule of thumb is more than 50% of science, it is usually to your benefit if you did well in the class to include it in your science GPA, if it has the potential to raise that science GPA for you. So even if you took a statistics class in the psychology department, that's a math course that can be counted in your BPCM GPA. And then there is the other GPA, and there is all other GPA, so AO, and that is all of your non-science coursework. So those are the 3 main GPAs that are seen on your application in the primary. There is sometimes some differences between science GPAs and the non-science GPA. Usually non-science GPA tends to be a little bit higher for most candidates, but your goal is you should be looking at that range when you're looking at schools using MSAR or the equivalent for DO schools or Texas schools to really see what the range of their science GPAs, their total GPA, and all other GPA is when you're building that school list and seeing if you fit their profile. MCAT scores. The MCAT is another really big, important component of the application. I think I've done many a seminar on the MCAT, and you can go back and there are all kinds of resources for me and other counselors on there about MCAT, as well as opportunities to work with counselors there. But the goal for the MCAT should be to get your best score the first time around that you're taking it. You want to be able to be really strong overall in all of the categories, so you don't have one category that's maybe weakening your overall score a little bit. Yeah, and then finally, the last big, well, I guess the experiences, I would say, is another big component. But another, before I move on from MCAT, a lot of people ask when to take the MCAT relative to when they apply. I recommend taking the MCAT. One, take it when you feel ready and you feel prepared. That's the most important time to take the MCAT. You don't want to rush it. It's not like the SAT or ACT where you're like, I'm just going to take it a bunch of times and get my best score. Different schools have different policies, whether they use the first score you use, the best score, an average of all the scores you get. So take it when you're ready. A good time to take the MCAT is, I like to say, by latest September, before the application cycle you're applying for. You can take it in January or even a little bit later, but it really allows you to know where your MCAT score is situated if you take it about 9 months in advance of applying, because that can really help with building out your school list, knowing whether or not you might want to plan to instead take some additional time and retake the MCAT. And then once you get your score back, you can then be like, okay, I'm going to retake it again in January before I apply if I really think that I can significantly improve my score. Or it might give you the opportunity to say like, okay, hey, like I'm just going to take a gap year. I'm going to take a little bit of time to work on my application, just get my bearings and take the MCAT again. So I always recommend relative to the primary date, latest to take it is September prior to the year you are applying. So that is coming up pretty soon. You can take it later. It just gets a little bit more difficult in terms of having the optimal timeline. Finally, the personal statement, 5,300 character essay detailing your motivation for medicine. I've done other full seminars on the personal statement, so I won't belabor the point here, but be original. Take an opportunity to really tell your story. Don't fall into cliches or patterns. There's a lot of resources online, some of them good, some of them not so good. Use your discretion. You want to tell a really compelling story. I always tell my students, write like you're writing for the New Yorker or the Atlantic. Write me something I want to read. It should be compelling, and it should be something that just doesn't cut and paste to the next pre-med. Because admissions officers, we read hundreds of applications or tens of applications a cycle. It's a lot of applications. Candidates can start to blur together. So anything you can do that can really make your statements stand out beyond, don't write your personal statement as a sonnet or a haiku, but take some liberties to get really creative with it is really going to be to your benefit. I recommend starting the personal statement around January to February of the application cycle that you're applying for. That tends to give plenty of time. About 4 to 5 months is a good amount of time, a good amount of lead time. Usually it only takes about 2 to 3 months to get it done, but you've also got your experiences sections, other things. So I tend to recommend with all of my clients, the first thing we start on is the personal statement, because sometimes it's the hardest. And we usually start around January, February prior to the application cycle. All right, next slide.
Great job, Nate. Just a few other components of your application. One is your work and activities. So you can have up to 15 activities listed in this section, with 3 of those activities being your most meaningful activities, where you can write an additional blurb about what how participating in that activity contributed to your skills that would be valuable in med school, like your leadership skills. This is a great time to highlight how you worked in a team and what you emotionally felt from those activities. And on top of that, last but definitely not least, there's also letters of recommendation. So it varies a little bit based on each school for how many you're required to have and how many you can submit up to. But typically, it's anywhere from 3 to 5 letters of recommendations. And this can be from your professors, this can be from physicians, this can be from other mentors. Usually at least one of them has to be from a science professor or someone who has mentored you in some sort of scientific capacity, whether that's a PI in your lab, if you're applying to any kind of research heavy MD program, or especially any MD PhD program, getting letters from your PI will also be important.
Yeah, and the only thing I have to add to that is ask early. If you're asking your professors, especially the ones who might get a lot of requests from a lot of people, ask them early. You want to beat the curve. You don't want to be with the rest of the group who's asking for that letter of recommendation just a month or two beforehand. Ask them the beginning of the semester and make a plan early so you know that you're going to have enough letters of recommendation. The minimum I usually suggest is that you at minimum get 2 science, 1 non-science professor who've taught you in a course. And then also the other ones that Ruchi mentioned as well are also really important to get it too.
Yeah, and also for this section, I would emphasize quality over quantity. So if you're thinking about getting 1 or 2 additional letters of recommendation from professors who don't really know you that well, and you're not totally sure what they might say about you in a letter, I think having a weak letter of recommendation is worse than having 3 letters of recommendation per se.
Absolutely. All right, so mastering the MCAT. Aim for a score within or above the average range for your target schools. I think there are numbers on here, but I like to say the numbers are different for everyone. And don't get too hung up on the MCAT. A standardized test does not define the kind of physician that you can or will be. So don't get too hung up on the MCAT. It's just a number. It's just a standardized test. That being said, I do think in terms of competitiveness, getting into a 510 plus range is good, and getting into a 515 plus range even better. Beyond that, like, it just definitely increases your odds of matriculation. I think it is really important to look at the types of schools that you're wanting to apply to and being really realistic about with where your GPA and your MCAT fall into. I advise for most candidates to look at the range, look between the 25th and the 75th percentile for the schools. That's where you should really be like, do I fit in this 25th to 75th percentile? Where do I fall in there? Your target schools should probably be falling somewhere between, like, your score is like at least between that 50th to 75th percentile is where I like to say the target schools are at. So trying to hit above that 50th percentile if you want that school to be a target school for you, because there's a lot of other components in the application as well. Consider your strengths and weaknesses in each section: Chem Phys, Bio and Biochem, Psych, Soc, and CARS. Those are the 4 sections of the MCAT. It's a long test. It's important to realize, like, what are your content strengths and weaknesses. So like, you're always missing that same question on the Krebs cycle. Every single time you do a practice exam, you need to realize that you need to go back and you need to memorize the Krebs cycle. Or if you're like really getting fatigued at the end of each section, or you are having issues with like directly pulling out information from the passage and applying it. So sort of like what I really recommend is doing a pattern analysis as you, I've tutored the MCAT for a while now too. As you take MCAT practice exams and a solid number of MCAT practice exams, you should, after each exam, go through all the questions you missed. Anything that you missed or flagged, write down the like content area. So if it's like Piaget's stages, or it's the Krebs cycle, or it's gosh, it's been so long for me now, electromagnetism or something like that. You write down the content area, you write down why you got it wrong, what is the right answer. So then you can start to do like this pattern analysis over like 4+, 8+ practice exams to really identify those weak areas and build upon them between each successive week of MCAT studying. Yeah, and we covered this earlier. Only retake the MCAT if you are confident you can significantly improve your score. Retaking the MCAT and your score going down is a really, it's not an impossible thing to bounce back from, but it is tough if you just sort of like you retake the MCAT a second time and your score is just sort of stagnated at the same spot or it's actually decreased. It's harder to bounce back from in an application. It's not impossible, but it's definitely something that raises an orange flag for an admissions committee. Just to pause a little bit on that MCAT score a little longer. So take it when you feel ready and only retake it if you're confident that you can improve. And if you need help figuring out how to improve, reach back out to Inspira or someone who, or a friend that you know that performed well on the MCAT, and they can probably give you some tips and tricks.
So next, building your personal statement. I really like the anecdote that Nate brought up earlier about trying to engage your audience. I think that's really important. So when you're reflecting on the experiences that you've had throughout your college career, try to think about the key moments that drew you to becoming a physician. And especially if there's any challenges that you've overcome, that's usually a pretty strong component of your application to highlight, or anything that you think helps you stand out against other applicants. One thing that I like to tell the people that I advise is that even if you think that the activities that you're talking about aren't unique in and of themselves, your individual experience throughout that is. So like, let's say you write an essay on being an EMT, for example. There's lots of other people who have had that same experience, but no one has seen or done the same exact things that you have. So being able to really make that as personal as possible and like key into how you felt during that experience or how that contributed to your journey is really important in helping you stand out, even if you think that your individual experience isn't that unique. And then also when you start to write your personal statement, you want to make sure that you have a strong structure. So having an introduction that's really compelling and grabs the reader from the beginning is great. I would advise you to not go too crazy with the hook. Sometimes people get so stuck on like trying to come up with something super unique that it ends up being more strange than engaging. So try to make sure that you don't go overboard on this part. For the actual body of your personal statement, you want to make sure that you discuss that experience in detail, whether it's your experience in the clinic, your experience in the lab, or your experience volunteering. And when you talk about that experience, make sure you tie it back into how that contributed to your journey in medicine, and not just make sure you don't just like detail what happened, basically. And then for your conclusion, you want to make sure that you re-emphasize those key details on how that prepared you for medical school and your future career as a physician.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to this is when I do this exercise with my clients, I like them to, one, think about the qualities or traits they think they have that will make them an excellent future physician. So what are the things that make you a good future physician? What competencies, traits, qualities in you are you trying to communicate to the admissions committee through your stories? And then that can sometimes help organize things, because maybe you want to say you have this passion for science. So you're not going to directly say you have a passion for science, but it can help you think about the anecdotes that really silently communicate and show rather than tell the admissions committee you have this passion for science, or you're like an empathetic, compassionate person who really wants to make an impact in community medicine. So think about your goals, your qualities, and those can help you sort of figure out which stories you might actually want to tell. Editing and refining your personal statement. Make your statement shine. Read your statement aloud to catch awkward phrasing or unclear ideas. Yeah, reading it aloud is great. Having other people read it is even better. Even if you're not working with a professional admissions counselor, have your parents, have your best friend, have a professor, have like anyone that you trust, read it over, see how it sounds, see how they interpret things. Remove content that doesn't directly support your main narrative. Yeah, it's really nice to have like a cohesive theme. So especially if you are sort of struggling with what to cut, figure out what your main theme is and how everything fits there, and get feedback from at least 2 trusted mentors or advisors who know you well. Yeah, I think getting feedback from people who know you well, also who know how to write. Not every doctor knows how to write, and that's all I'll say on that. And that's all I got.
Yeah, just one additional quick point is I think that there is like a sweet spot of how many people to get feedback from. And I would say 2 to 3 people is probably where I would try to stick around, because people are going to have different thoughts and opinions on your personal statement. And I think up to that point, it's helpful. But if you send your personal statement to too many people, I think you might get too many ideas back. And then I think it's really hard to synthesize that into your final personal statement.
That's an excellent point. Totally agree.
So some common mistakes in personal statements. One is an emphasis on grades or scores. So I totally agree with what Nate said earlier. Just speaking from my own personal experience at my school, there are so many people in my class that have MCAT scores that were way below the average. So I don't think that that should stop you from applying to your dream school. So I think that it's important to use that to guide your application process, but it's not everything. And you definitely shouldn't mention that in your personal statement. I think that that's information that the committee already has, and they will use that in the way that they've determined is the best way to process that information for their holistic review, but it shouldn't come up again in your personal statement. That's really more for your experiences and moments throughout your college career that you think really highlight your growth. Number 2 is focusing too much on others. So I think that this is a really common mistake that I see in a lot of personal statements, especially when you're talking about, like, let's say an experience you had with a physician and how much you look up to them. I think it's important to still make sure that the focus is on yourself. So if there's something that you really admire in someone else, or there's an experience that impacted someone else and then had an impact on you, make sure that you always come back to how that impacted your journey and your development as a person, and not just the qualities in someone else that you really admire. And number 3 is the lack of a clear narrative or theme. So you want to make sure that your essay has an overall like message that you want the reader to take away with them, and that the experiences that you detail all lead cohesively towards that theme. So make sure you avoid jumping from disparate topics that don't build a cohesive story. Next, we're gonna highlight some of your key experiences and activities. Nate, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So on highlighting your experiences and activities, yes, you want to clearly describe your role and responsibilities in each experience. I think talking about a lot of like actionable language, taking it as an opportunity to like sort of show off while still being like modest, striking that right balance. You want to come across as impressive. Use specific examples to show how you've applied medical knowledge in real world settings. I'm going to change that a little bit. Use specific examples in general. This was something that is a big, it's what a lot of people miss in their application. And it's something I actually personally missed in my application. And I realize now after reading a ton of applications that this is absolutely what you should be doing. But you should be using specific anecdotes in your experiences section Sort of similar in a way to your personal statement. You want to strike a solid balance of it, but this is not a resume. You're not like just like bullet pointing all your skills and achievements and accomplishments and roles and responsibilities. You really want to be using stories again to illustrate your qualities, your competencies, and your like all those traits that you want the admissions committee to see that's going to get them to accept you. So think about how you can take little stories to actually get that point across. You should get in the idea of your like roles and responsibilities, but also in that space, you want to strike the balance of seeing if you can get in a little bit of a story as well. And there's some really good examples of that online. If you're entirely confused about what I'm talking about, check Reddit, go to the pre-med forum. There are some good examples on how to write the activities section, or again, talk to a counselor. They'll have a lot of insights on that as well. Yeah, highlight your moments where you demonstrate your empathy, communication skills, and teamwork. Think about the things that make a good doctor, a good physician, and think about how you can silently demonstrate that to the admissions committee that you have those traits. And another thing people forget on here, you can include your hobbies. If you're a marathon runner, tell me about it. Like, I want to know about those things outside of medicine that just make you a human being and not just a pre-med robot. Like, talk about your hobbies if you have a hobby. It can really go a long way to humanize your application and like help to remind us that you're like a person with other interests outside of just medicine. You're just like not solely focused on my entire life is getting into medical school. That helps. That's all I got.
Next, we're going to talk about highlighting research and volunteer experiences. So these will also go under that same activity section. For research experiences, emphasize your specific contributions to the project. I think that this really stands out to me and probably also Nate as MD PhD students. I think that when people are talking about their research, it's really easy to just talk about what the project was and not how you specifically contributed to that project and what you took away from that and how you helped progress that project along. And I think that's kind of what they're looking for. Like, are you scientifically curious? And then do you have the capability to take on a project independently and really help it develop? For volunteer work, you want to focus on your commitment to that project and the impact that you made on the community. So here, instead of just saying, I volunteered 20-something hours at this clinic for this amount of time, you want to talk about how your commitment grew and developed throughout that time. If you took on more roles as the years progressed, I think that's a really great thing to highlight, or like any specific impact in your community that you saw throughout that role. So during your time, if you saw like how many people your volunteer organization helped and how it helped grow support in the community, I think that's really great too. And then lastly, make sure you discuss any leadership roles and how they developed your skills in managing teams or projects. You'll see in your secondary applications there are many, many prompts that ask you about times that you worked in a team or when you've overcome obstacles. So I think your leadership roles are a really great space to discuss some of those soft skills.
Cool. So creating a cohesive narrative. I like this. I think it's about finding an angle for your medical school application. And there are lots of different angles you can really take with your medical school application. Where it all starts is pursuing the interests that you're passionate about. Like if you hate doing research, like you absolutely hate doing research, it's going to come across a little bit in your application. Like you're not going to be able to hide that. So you don't want to go and create this application where you're like, oh, I'm going to go become this academic physician who wants to balance research with medicine. Like that's not your passion. And that's okay. Like you don't have to stick at that lab bench job that you absolutely are uninterested in. Go pursue the other passions in medicine that you're interested in. It's not just about checking off boxes. It's about finding experiences where you have this mutual relationship with, where you contribute something to them, but you also grow through the experience and you learn things about yourself. I've seen really, really compelling different angles in people's applications. I've worked with clients who've had this angle that they have, like, they were like an untraditional student. They were sort of in between pre-law and pre-med and was like really interested in politics. So a lot of their experiences, like they didn't really have a lot of research experience. They didn't have a whole lot of hospital clinic volunteer experience. Like they had less than the average student, but they had a huge amount of political involvement experience and like these really like untraditional and novel experiences for pre-med. So our angle for that application became like talking about how they were like their interest in public health and their interest in medicine and all these skills they've developed from working in politics and how they can actually really marry these two together to act in the realms of like political advocacy and create changes. So that being said, when you're creating like this cohesive narrative and this like angle for your application, like who are you? What are you going to do as an applicant? You don't have to have like this cookie cutter, picture perfect application where you check all the boxes and you're like, all right, I've done everything that a pre-med needs to do to get into medical school. Instead, you should be thinking about what are the things I'm passionate about? How do those relate to medicine? And it can be like different kinds of experiences, like political experience or advocacy experience, or it can be working with certain types of specific populations. Like some people like working with unhoused populations or working with like elderly and end of life care populations. So go out there, pursue the experiences that really like fill up your cup at the end of the day. And I promise that I'll send your application so much further than sticking with the experiences that you just dread going into. Cool. Next slide.
So next, crafting the work and activity section. So first, you want to prioritize your most impactful experiences. So make a list of all your experiences first, and then think about the 3 that you can talk about the most, or write up a rough draft about a bunch and see which ones have had the most significant impact on your personal and professional development, and which ones you think contribute the most to your narrative or the angle of your application, like Nate was talking about earlier. Next, you want to make sure that you use action verbs and quantify your achievements. So if there's like something concrete that you took away from each experience, or like, let's say that there's some sort of like definite impact that those activities had on your community or on your university, I think that's really great. If there's like any awards or publications or something that you walked away with, I think that's really important to include as well. And then next, you want to make sure you keep your descriptions clear and concise. So make sure that you don't get too wordy, make sure that you include all those like key accomplishments, but also make sure that they contribute either to your goals in pursuing medicine, or I completely agree. I think that it's okay to have interests that are outside of what you might typically see in a pre-med. And if it's something about your hobbies, talk about how that contributed to your personal growth.
Cool. So securing strong letters of recommendation. Ask the right people. When you ask people for a letter of recommendation, ask if they can write you a strong letter of recommendation. If they hesitate to write you a letter of recommendation, that's usually a pretty good sign that you should go and ask someone else for a letter of recommendation. You should start to plan this out early. Think about it really early so you're not scrambling at the last minute. I've worked with all kinds of clients who feel like they're like sort of scrambling at the last minute because like they didn't realize that they should have like 2 science, 1 non-science at minimum, and maybe they have some like extenuating circumstances where like they didn't really build any strong relationships with their science professors because like maybe it was COVID or sometimes some other reasons, or like people had reasons that they like couldn't make the lectures, stuff like that. So just start with a strategy early on. All right.
And then aligning recommendations with your narrative. I think the key takeaway from this slide is just like, let's say your key takeaway is that I'm a really good researcher, then not having a letter of recommendation from your PI might be kind of questionable. Or if you highlight this one community activity, and then you don't have a letter of recommendation from the leader of that activity, I think that might also be viewed as a little strange. So if there's some angle of your application that's really important, having letters of recommendation that can support your role in that activity is a really great way to help build up your application.
Yeah, so this says 2 to 3 months before the application deadline. I would say that's like a minimum. I would say start asking around February before you plan to apply. So that's about 4 months in advance. If you wait 2 to 3 months, you're going to be with, like, that's a plenty of time for them to write you a letter of recommendation. But then you get thrown in with the bulk of everyone else who is asking. If you want to beat the rush of people who are asking and you want it to like them to like be the first one you say yes to, like, then I would ask 4 months. Supporting materials are important. I think a CV is really important. You can give them your personal statement if you feel comfortable with it. It's not absolutely necessary that they have your personal statement. And this is also a really good point. You can ask them to highlight certain things or accomplishments or achievements in their letter. They don't have to do it, but sometimes you can mention with them. Also, another thing, set up an in-person meeting with them to talk about the letter, especially if it's like a professor that you don't have that personal of a relationship with. Like if it's that OChem professor that you went to office hours a bunch, but that was 2 years ago now, you should set up a time to meet in person with them for them to like sort of start to refresh, remember your face. If it's the PI that you see every single week or like 3 times a week, like you probably don't need to set up like that, like personal meeting, but it doesn't hurt. I'm just saying, especially for those professors who like, it's maybe been a while since they've seen your face, when you reach out, ask if you can set up a personal meeting with them. That'll give you the opportunity to sort of explain your motivations for med school, and then also talk about any things you might want them to highlight.
So ensuring submission of strong letters. So let's say that you did your due diligence, you asked your letter recommender in February if they could write you a letter, and it's now May and you haven't heard anything and you haven't seen anything be submitted. I think it's okay after like 1 month before your letter is due just to send a reminder and then keep an eye on your application portal and make sure that those letters were submitted. You'll get a notification once they come in. And after your letter has been submitted, I think it's a really nice gesture to reach out to them and thank them because they took the time to write you a letter to help support your application.
Absolutely. Yeah, generic or weak letters. Don't pick people who don't know you well enough. They should be able to have specific examples. Yeah, they need to be able to have specific examples in order to like really bolster your application. Guide your recommenders by providing them with context and key points to include. Ensure their letters reinforce your overall application narrative.
And then lastly, preparing for your secondary application. So once you submit your primary application, it varies a little bit when you'll get your secondary application from each school. Don't read into it. I think it's most likely just some sort of automated computer system. So don't be like, oh my God, other people got their secondary application first. Yours is coming. And then your secondary application will vary a little bit based on some schools. Some schools will have really short ones. Some will be really long, but there'll be additional questions to help assess your fit for each school. So try to prepare for these essays in advance before you get them so you can submit your secondary application quickly.
Pre-write. You start pre-writing June 1st after that primary is submitted. You should have like, I'm going to say you should have at least half of your schools pre-written before July 1st. So during the month of June, you should have at least half your schools pre-written.
Amazing. I'm going to pop back in here. First and foremost, thanks, guys. This has been incredibly educational, and I think both of you provided so much content and knowledge, and you have such a strong background on this topic, but I think you have so much wisdom to share as well, and your passion for academia definitely shines through. So we are over time, so I think we only have time for about a question or two, and a question that I saw earlier in the chat, and I'm paraphrasing, has to do with having a dream school in mind, but maybe not meeting up to the standards and typical qualifications of someone who goes to that school. And sort of any advice that you have for that person. Should they still submit, or should they just, continue to strengthen their application in a way?
I can take that one. This actually is really close to my heart because Yale was my dream school, and my GPA as a chem major, who maybe shouldn't have been a chem major, was like a little bit on the low side. And I was like, I really want to apply anyways. So I think an important takeaway from the session is that while most of your schools should be in a target range, and it should be you want to make sure that you get into medical school at the end of the day. So I think it's important to have a realistic school list, but I don't think that means that you shouldn't apply to a school you really love. I think that if you really do love that school and you think that it's a great fit for you, then you'll be able to highlight that in your secondary application. You'll be able to talk about that during your interview, and I think your passion for a certain school goes a long way.
Absolutely, I agree with that entirely. I always tell people, if you are going to regret not having shot your shot for that school and applying down the road, then you've got to throw it in there. If that being said, you're not willing to go to any other medical school but that school, then maybe you think about how you can strengthen your application in a couple other ways. But it's always going to be worth it to apply for that school if it's your dream school.
Awesome, thank you. And another question, just sort of any tips that final tips you may have regarding not being or not getting discouraged through this process, because clearly it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of it's a long process, as we've obviously demonstrated. So any sort of advice?
Yeah, I'll start. I think staying organized, starting off early so you don't feel stressed and rushed, giving yourself enough time to work on things will help you feel less stressed. So starting really early, working with a solid timeline. If you're not working with a professional admissions counselor, reaching out to your pre-med office, maybe have them help you put together a timeline or something like that. I think those are all really helpful, and still, especially when you're studying for the MCAT too, still making time for yourself. And that'll be important in medical school too, eventually when you get there. Make time for yourself, still take time to go exercise, or play an instrument that you love to do, or listen to music, or paint, or whatever it is that fills up your cup at the end of the day is going to be really important for you to continue that stamina throughout the process. And I think that's both true for the MCAT and true for the application season. You need to make time to take care of yourself in order to be able to be performing at your best. And if you want to be performing at your best when you're putting together your application, it's really important just to remember to take care of yourself. So don't feel guilty when you take a couple hours off to go do whatever's really important to you.
Yeah, I just really want to emphasize what Nate said about making sure that you're still having fun and that you're still doing things that are important to you. Two other specific pieces of advice. One is stay off of Reddit and SDN. That's something that I was so guilty of during the application process, was just laying in bed at 3 a.m. and seeing if there were any interviews that came out or something like that. So try to stay off of those sites. I don't think it's good for your mental health, and it's not actually contributing any additional information at the end of the day. And I think second of all, trying to stay in touch with people who love you, like keep calling your family, calling your friends that are not in the pre-med world, especially. And I think just like connecting with people that see your value as a person and can remind you of the fact that you're going to be an excellent physician and that you're going to contribute something to whatever medical school you end up at.
Beautiful. I think we're already over time, so I think this is a really great spot to end tonight's session. And thank you for the wonderful conversation, Nate and Ruchi. Thank you to our audience, and we look forward to hosting you on the next webinar.
Yeah, nice to meet y'all. Good luck in the process. You got this.